quite a meaty article to read through, but on a different topic to what we've been chatting about recently, which is really focused quite strongly on issues around richness of data, on quality in data, and now moving on to writing, which is obviously a big part of what we have to do. So yeah, I'm hoping that we will learn some good tips today, and I'm sure it'll be an engaging discussion as always. So thank you, Megan, for leading today.
Yeah,
Do you want to go for it?
So yeah, like Jenny said, this was definitely a really, when I was going through sort of the list of articles to choose for Journal Tab today, this one kind of immediately sort of caught my attention, just because I think it really is such a difficult task to write persuasively. And I think especially being in the sort of the health communication research unit, or all of us who kind of intersect between medical humanities and have an interest in qualitative research, or are qualitative researchers, but all are doing something to do with healthcare, or a lot of us are. I think it is a really difficult task to convey qualitative data and to do it in a sort of convincing manner, especially when you are trying to get into traditional sort of quantitative journals. So I think that was kind of why we chose this article today. I agree with you, Jenny. I had to read this article about 4 times to really sort of get, and I still don't know if I completely understand all of it, because it was a lot to kind of mull over and digest. But really,
sorry, I'm going to interrupt you there. I think it's actually reflective of the intricacy and the nuance of qualitative work.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think also what really came to mind as well is that, again, it was a paper on how to write persuasively, and they themselves had to have that task.
Absolutely.
To be persuasive in terms of, what are the tips and tricks and what are the things that caught their attention. And the methods that they used was to kind of go over 29, lots of different articles, and of essentially which they chose 29, all of which very different methodologies, all very different topics. And again, they admit it really was a subjective process as to what stood out for them. And it might be the same for us going forward, that like really there is no perfect rubric in terms of how to do this and how to write convincingly, and what deems a good article. And it really all can be very subjective, but they kind of all agree that there were certain points that are important to consider when writing. So they start off with this quote, which I thought was quite, I don't know if other people noticed this quote as well, but half-convinced writers trying to half-convince readers of their half-convictions would not on the face of it seem an especially favorable situation for the production of works of very much power. And I think that is something that we all struggle with, or what I certainly struggle with, is that you really have to be confident in your writing, and you really have to believe in your own convictions when writing. And I think especially when it comes to being a junior academic or someone who's kind of still finding their feet in academia, to feel that you have a seat at the table and that you have something to say, and that you're allowed to be assertive and you're allowed to really have an opinion. And I think that can be quite challenging, especially when qualitative writing historically has always been given sort of a bad rep, that it's kind of this fluffy, not really scientific enough, not good enough when it comes to sort of these big, powerful journals that really focus on quantitative writing. And I think they use the expression, what was the term?
Terrible. The red-haired stepchild.
Yeah. I did think that was hurtful. I really did.
They're cousins of the red-headed stepchild. It wasn't even the red-headed stepchild, it was their cousin. So,
come on.
So I did laugh at that comment. And that really, things are starting to shift.
Yeah, I think it's so important as well, though, to also believe in the findings and the work that you've done. And I think often that's an issue, that we don't actually believe that we have something to contribute to the global conversation, or we don't believe that we are capable of actually producing good work that's good enough for the international stage, certainly. And I think those self-doubts are often there, and they come through in the way that we write. So, instead of really setting up a convincing argument, we'll kind of hide it in, well, these are interesting results, and this is nice data.
Yeah, exactly.
Kind of weak and feeble, and
exactly. I think things are starting to change in the sense that qualitative research is definitely starting to be acknowledged more and more. And, there's been a lot of change with regard to policy with journals, including qualitative work, and sort of having editors and experts on their review committees, sort of encouraging qualitative work. I think also what is challenging with qualitative research is that they talk about this sort of methodological plurality, and that there are so many different methods, there are so many ways and angles to look at data, whereas quantitative is very much sort of, it's quite black and white, whereas qualitative work can be quite grey. And I think because it's not understood, or there's kind of so many different, like I said, angles, a lot of people can be dismissive of it because they feel that it's not clearly understood. And I think that's what we have to do as qualitative researchers, to really make sense of that grey for people, and kind of convince them that there really is a lot of value in looking at things in different ways. So there are lots of different criteria, and they talk about that, it's easy to kind of go onto the internet these days or look in journals and books, and that way there are lots of different qualitative manuscript guidelines in terms of what is considered good qualitative work. There's also been lots of debate as to whether qualitative research should be assessed in the same way that quantitative research is assessed, or whether there should be different criteria in terms of how it is assessed. And I think there should be, because there are quite big differences. But really the sort of current guidelines that they talk about is kind of this contribution. Does the research contribute to theory? Is it novel? Is there transparency in terms of what was done? And often in qualitative research, they often talk about sort of, could this research be duplicated by another researcher? Have you explained your process clearly? Have you explained some of your choices, why you did things the way you did? And one of the big things, and they kind of talk about it further along the line in terms of what they also value, what the authors value particularly, is really your method section. I think this is kind of the big crux. And I remember during my PhD, and I spent months going back and forth about the method section. I mean, that really is the big part of your research, is, can you describe your methods clearly, and does it make sense to the reader and to the reviewer, in terms of not only has the research topic been covered adequately, but also have you done justice to the method itself. And then it really comes to good writing. With quantitative research, we tend to rely on statistics and p-values, and there sort of are these statistical methods that they use to sort of quantify and to justify that this is good research or good data. But for qualitative research, it's really about, can you articulate the data and the methods clearly by writing? We all have to be good writers, and I know that is tricky. I don't know if anyone else experiences the same thing. Yeah,
I think what's interesting about, like, you talking about how difficult it was in your PhD to articulate the methods, and for me with a quantitative PhD, the methods was the easiest part. It's very straightforward. It's like, we did this, we did this, we did this. We used this, measuring device, and we used this standard, and we did this test, and it's like, you write it and you're done, and you never think about it again, But I think with qualitative, you are the instrument. Like the person who's doing the research is the instrument. So that's like, how do you describe your experience of an environment? Because that's essentially what then goes into your results.
Absolutely. And I think also with qualitative, like you said, Siobhan, you are the instrument, but also you're constantly having to make choices. Whereas in quantitative, there is only one choice.
Yes.
Like you kind of follow a stepwise like process. So you did this, you did this, you did this.
You have this kind of data, you do this kind of test.
Yeah, whereas for qualitative researchers, you're constantly having to make choices that you kind of get to the next step, and then there are 5 different directions that you could go, and you have to say, okay, well, I've chosen, I'm going to go in this direction, and this is why. And even your number of participants that you choose, in quantitative, you often have these big data sets, whereas in qualitative, sometimes you can have 5 participants. And you kind of have to justify that again as to why is that enough of being able to articulate, sort of a phenomenon, or to sort of say that this is still of value, even though I have such a small data set.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think also with qualitative, you're really getting into these issues around positionality and reflexivity already when you're describing methods. And so that is a process that's happening from the start. Whereas, as you say, Siobhan, with a quant study, positionality is not really something one engages with, although these days there is some debate coming up in the literature about whether or not quantitative researchers actually need to engage with that. I think they do.
Yeah.
Absolutely. But traditionally, no, it's, as you say, it's, the test is already kind of chosen. The data speaks for itself. The numbers determine which tests you use or how you do the stats.
But I found that, like with my PhD work, like we, in quantitative, you're not trained to think like that. And then when I did undergrad psychology, and it's like, oh, think about how you, and then I was like, who I am has influenced the questions I've decided to ask. Like that's where it starts. Is that as a person, I've decided to ask these questions about this population. And it's me, this person who's come to the conclusion that these questions are important. And, and that's where it then became a thing of, if somebody else was asking these questions, or if somebody from this population was asking these questions, what would they want to ask? And that's, I think as quantitative researchers, we're not actually taught to think like that. And I think that's a big omission, actually. I think that it's a failure of training in quantitative research.
So you're completely removed from the data and the project.
Yeah.
But you, like you say, I think who you are as a researcher, your background, all of that will influence how you analyze data and how you see.
I was also just thinking about the method that I used in the workshops. So I think the difficult thing with qualitative research is also the fact that you can never exactly duplicate what's been done before, even though there are some things like the PIP where there's steps to follow, but they can never be exactly the same. With the drawings that I used, I did find papers before, but I couldn't really do it the way that they did it. And like with, I guess, quant, there's just like one standard way of doing it, and then you just have to, well, I guess depending on the reviewer, just fight and like this is how I did it, and it also works, that type of thing. So I think we find that with quantitative, we always have to prove and justify our method,
and that can be exhausting. It can that self-doubt can creep in, because like you say, you kind of have to sort of believe in your own convictions, and you're constantly having to justify to others why this is of value, and that can be exhausting because it does chip away at your sort of your confidence, and you think, well, what am I doing, and why is this of value, and does it matter? And it's kind of
before you get to the reviewers.
It's like this big internal battle and grappling and
exactly.
Just when you were saying about the writing style, what struck me through this article was their willingness to actually talk about story, narrative, and creativity.
Mm.
And I think that that's what's made quantitatives twitchy. You know, that the narrative and the creative aspect of it.
But really good quantitative writers, I know this, like there were some, my honors supervisor, and he would say, it's a story. You're writing a story. You're taking data and you're writing a story about it. If you don't write a story about the data, it's not compelling, even when it's quantitative data.
Of course, yes, you're right.
But what I find, though, on the creativity side is that sometimes even if you start pushing the buttons and kind of pushing boundaries with how you frame and package your qualitative paper, some editors are open to that and others are not. Same with reviewers. So, even within the qualitative world, there's as Sonta was saying, there's such kind of deviation in terms of how things are done and what is the qualitative tradition, or what is the way that we do things in the qualitative world. There isn't a set way. And so one can bump one's head against, I'm trying to be creative, and somebody says, well, you're not doing it right.
You're not scientific enough.
I don't like that. Because, I think the other thing that also struck me was that quote, like, you have to provide enough data to permit readers to draw their own conclusions and yet provide interpretations, which speaks to you. Sometimes, like, nobody's going to do it the same way.
Yeah.
But you've got to, the data has got to be robust enough so that they can look at it from their own perspectives and maybe add something to it. I don't know.
And I think also I quite liked, I don't know which page it is, but they talk about sort of being, my French is terrible, so excuse me if I butcher this word, but savoir faire, like to sort of have sort of respect and the way that you conduct yourself in sort of a social situation, in the sense that you have to be assertive enough, but you have to do it in a respectful way, and you kind of have to acknowledge where the review is coming from or where the audience may be coming from in terms of who you're writing for and for which journal you're writing. So you almost have to present your work, but do it in a way that kind of still is respectful towards other people who may not be familiar with this type of approach. And that, so like you say, to do it that you're not going to upset people and be like, no, this is ridiculous, how can they say this, or I don't agree with this, but you say, I get that you might not agree, but this is why I think this might work. Or to just your word choice and the way that you present your data to be sort of convincing but also respectful, not to kind of just go into a quantitative, not to sort of try apply to get into a quantitative journal and then kind of say, well, quantitative research is rubbish and this is we should be qualitative, but like to have a way, and I suppose a decorum and way in how you present your work as well. So the current challenges with qualitative research and trying to be convincing is really sort of the development of new theories, and this is kind of what they say is sort of how you kind of still have to acknowledge the existing theories and you still have to acknowledge sort of the current work that's being done, but you kind of respectfully sort of say, well, maybe we can take this a little bit further, or we can see it from a different way. Restrictive journal standards and formats. I think we've all experienced that where journals are open to qualitative research, but then they say you have a word limit of 1,500 words. Or, and they don't take into consideration that the way that data is presented, you can't just fit it into any table. You have to sort of include quotes and you have to include stories, and that's really hard when it comes to these restrictive journal standards and formats.
Yeah, I was just thinking of Rona's point here about putting in enough data, and I think that's something I struggle with tremendously because you're always being selective when you pick up data and quotes, and you're never necessarily presenting the whole picture. So how much is enough? I think that's tricky, and again, trying to figure out how to weave it in so that it's not just this kind of rambling, boring story.
Or like you say, just to take a snippet of the word and it's not really in context for the rest, the rest sort of what happened prior or after that conversation.
Absolutely.
Can be interpreted very differently.
And the majority of studies that we do that are qualitative have way too much data. So much data, and very difficult then to package it. I think it's only been one study that I worked on where we used incidental data that we'd gathered that wasn't even for the purpose that we wrote about. And then we were scratching around trying to find enough quotes to substantiate the idea we were putting forward. But mostly one just has too much. Yeah. So
that's when you were saying about justifying that you only have 5 participants. I was thinking about like Charmaine's studies where she's got 10 interviews at 3 different hospitals, and like how impossible it is to like make sense of that much data. And like how you almost do more justice to the participants, I feel like, when, well, I suppose it depends on the question, but like I feel like I can engage with each participant more clearly when it's like fewer, you know, and like to actually tell their story or to really take in what they say, and, you know.
Yeah, because I suppose then you kind of almost get like just I suppose just like a small like snippet really of what each participant said or what each participant's experience was, but you didn't really sort of sit and really dwell with each participant. But again, in terms of journal formats and really the limitations that we have in space, you have to be selective, and that's really tricky when you're still trying to be authentic and provide rich and detailed data. And then really our ability to communicate, compel, and to make not just cognitive sense, but also effective sense. I think
it's interesting.
A lot of it is kind of, when we write, it's not just about making intellectual sense, but also to kind of, I suppose, stir some sort of emotion for the reader or for the reviewer in terms of, you know, why does this data matter and why is this an important finding? And they make a quote as well about writing in a way that you want readers to read your work. And they talk about sort of word choice again, and kind of not just like Jenny said, to kind of just ramble on about stuff that, you know, it's actually boring, that after page 2 you think, oh, pretty interested in reading, you know, 40 pages of this. So yeah, kind of they acknowledge that these are challenges and not easy to do. So the authors of this particular paper were all from international business and management schools or institutes, and they wanted to focus on management and organizational scholars who had published qualitative research in leading academic generalist management journals between 2009 and 2015. And so they all kind of come from business schools and management backgrounds in terms of their training and interests. And they wanted to look particularly at qualitative papers that were published within these journals. And they do mention the journals. I'm not going to, so it was in my presenter view. But yeah, it's all sort of business related journals in terms of how did these qualitative papers convince or write convincingly.
Which is tricky because it's so subjective. You know, I could read a paper and the rest of you could read a paper, and I find the paper really great, and maybe you look at it and think, gosh, no. So how do we define what is convincing as well?
Absolutely. And they acknowledge that. They say that they sort of between them, I think it's on this page here, they kind of, they sort of reorganized their samples several times, went away kind of alone, sort of reread stuff, got some of their postgraduate students to read all these articles again, and all of them, it took a while for them to kind of decide on these 29 journals, or 29 papers rather, that these were the ones that they were going to choose, because they all were very different in terms of their methodologies. But the things that they kind of that stuck out for them in terms of what they ended up deciding was really a confident and clear and candid rhetoric, a solid and transparent methodological craftsmanship, a compelling, lively authenticity and energy. I quite like the word energy in writing. You know, how do you write energetically?
And it comes back to that affective, what were you talking about? The cognitive and the affective sense coming through in a paper. Yeah.
And it's like Siobhan says, it's about that storytelling, and I think they also liken it to sort of music composure, is that it has to stir something for the reader and for the reviewer from an emotional point of view. Strong reflexivity, that was one of the big things. And I think we've always, I almost feel like at every journal club, that's something that comes up, is that reflexivity is really.
We should start every journal club by saying reflexivity.
I need to write it on the board.
Yeah.
And they also, I mean, I'll talk about it in a moment, but they talk about reflexivity in action and on action. So there's sort of this reflexivity that occurs during the research process, that you obviously have to document in your writing in terms of again, choices and how you felt and where you come from in terms of positionality. But then also at the end of the project, when you are writing up your work, to kind of step back and look at it almost from a holistic perspective and sort of a broad overview and say, sort of, what does this all mean? And I suppose to challenge some of the things that could have been done differently, or some of the things that worked or didn't work. And I suppose also kind of to be challenging of current thoughts and ideas, and to say that maybe we need to reconsider things in another way. And also not just be reflexive as the author, but to get your audience to be reflexive as well in terms of how they think about things. And perhaps we need to be looking at things differently in terms of how we practice or how we see certain activities.
I was thinking that about like a convincing paper, and like what I would consider to be a most convincing paper is one that makes me change my mind. Like if I read something that I already believe that, I'm like, oh, of course, very convincing, right? But then if I thought something and I read something and then I'm like, oh, actually, I need to think differently about that. I think that's the most convincing, something that makes
something that we haven't considered that before.
Yes.
Yeah,
and that requires a bit of bravery, I think. Again, coming back to the point I made right at the beginning of our session of actually feeling worthy and feeling that I have something to contribute that's solid to the international conversation. And so to be convincing, you really have to believe in what you're saying. It's not always easy.
And I think that goes, they say that point 4 and 5, reflexivity is quite closely linked to imagination, in that you need to have a touch of imagination, but you also need to be brave in making those claims. And again, when you make those claims and sort of suggest something that is different to current thought, again, it's about getting your audience or your reviewers to say, oh, I haven't thought about it in that way. And maybe we need to look into that a little bit more.
So having vision almost.
Yes, yeah. And that is it does take confidence, and it is something that I think I certainly struggle with. I remember also Jenny, you correcting me often in my writing, and I still have to do it, is where I will write something and I'll be like, maybe this is something that we should consider, and perhaps, and there's like mitigated hedge claims, and then Jenny and even Claire Penn would say, no, take out perhaps and take out maybe, and say
they used to say, don't wimp out.
So
the fashion. She'd say, be punchy, start with something punchy.
And make sort of, put your head on the block and say, this is what I think, or this is what the finding means. And that takes confidence, and it can be quite daunting and scary, especially, like you say, if you kind of writing to audiences that traditionally don't always deal with qualitative work, or don't fully understand qualitative work.
And then also getting the balance right between not making these wild claims that then aren't backed up with the data. That quote that you were showing just now, Rona, so important to have the interpretation and the data. So the strong, confident, brave claims have to be grounded in what you're seeing in the data.
But as a reader, you want something to read that you kind of can hang your hat on. So, I think also you've got to think of the reader. If everything's wishy-washy, you're left going, what am I supposed to think? What was it saying? So I think we've also almost got to write with the reader in mind.
Absolutely. And I think we also talk about sort of being clear and punchy, but also to be pragmatic, because I think sometimes qualitative research, we fall into the trap where it can be very theoretical, it can be very wishy-washy, and they're like, well, so what? How is this going to change anything? And I think especially in the medical humanities, where a lot of the research is, with the idea that it becomes practical knowledge that they can use, and it can kind of be implemented into guidelines or practice, or that it becomes useful knowledge. That I think we also have to, particularly, I'm not saying for all qualitative research, but I think for this area that we tend to focus on, there has to be direction and a strategy or an outcome to your claims. That it can't just be like, well, that's a nice idea.
Yeah.
But but yeah, what are we going to do with this? Can we use it in a practical and pragmatic way? And I think that's what I've really appreciated about the HCLU focus, is that a lot of our work is pragmatic, and that we really want to feed it back into practice and hopefully make change on the ground in terms of the work that we do. And that's certainly something that kind of caught my attention in this paper as well. So just to kind of break down each point, they had quite nice tables within the paper. Obviously, they have, in the beginning of the paper, they've got sort of on table 1 the different papers that they chose and sort of why they thought these papers were of interest. I think everyone can kind of go through that in their own time, but it's from page, from table 2, they really kind of start showing sort of points for each, a table for each point in terms of why they think these 5 points work. So
Megan, just one thing that struck me about this as writers, don't do tables that are orientated that way, because most people read it off a computer.
No, I also found that that's why I printed it.
You actually don't read the table. You don't read it. I think it's such a good lesson for us that don't have those.
No, I also,
what are they? Landscape tables. Just don't.
I also admit also that's why sort of table 1 I kind of had to print it because I couldn't actually.
It was very cumbersome to manage.
Yeah, that was quite And then I also found the layout was confusing, because they would have sort of, they talk about point 1, which was rhetoric, but then the table would be like 3 pages later, on suggestions on rhetoric, and then so you were constantly sort of jumping between the pages, which I found also a little bit frustrating, and I didn't love this table.
But I had no idea.
Diagram.
No, I wasn't sure.
I thought there could have been a better way of doing it.
I think they really battled, these authors, with this paper. It's a good idea, but the actual practicality of trying to find papers and identify aspects in them is really, really tough to do.
It's a tricky topic, and again, subjective. They thought these were good points, and we agree, but again, we would do it differently, or we just think, oh, we didn't like the way they structured this. So again, it all sort of is ironically all subjective again. But rhetoric is really, if you had to define it, is the expertise of discourse, the capability to inform, persuade, and engage one's audience. So what they have pointed out, that when it comes to writing persuasively, you really need to be clear, concise, and engaging with your writing style, which we've said before. Voice choice was interesting. So whether you choose to write in the active voice or the passive voice is also interesting, whether you choose to write in first person or more objectively. And this is something that I struggled with, coming from a quantitative background and a science background. When I started coming into qualitative research, was really sort of writing in first person, that I did this research, or the researcher, rather than saying the researcher then did this. It was like, I did this and I thought this, and putting quite sort of personal stories and things into my writing, which I wasn't used to. And again, they say about finding that balance, kind of in certain situations, sort of writing in first person to sort of, I suppose, create that effective sort of feeling, but then also to know when it's more appropriate to write more in sort of an objective manner. And kind of, they talk about sort of balancing and weaving your way through sort of the way that you write your things.
Sorry, I was just thinking of, there's a very good book I've got by a woman called Helen Sword, And she's analyzed good writing, not necessarily qualitative, just in general, good academic writing. And that was a fascinating read as well, because what she shows is that the best writers are ones who write very simply. So very short sentences, not this fluffy language that no one can understand. It's just simple, to the point, but very compelling because it's so straightforward. So that's another very good read if one is looking for more on this rhetoric aspect and how to enhance that. Yeah, so Helen's sword, like sword as in SWORD. Like the weapon, yes, she's done quite a lot of analysis of good writing style in academia.
Thanks. Vocabulary choice again, and then attitude, which is really sort of establishing authority and also knowing when to be humble. And I think that comes back into that reflexivity, is that you write convincingly and you write in an assertive manner, but also sort of admitting where things have been a challenge, and to write, they always say that your writing shouldn't be about sort of just presenting this perfect package with a bow on it. It's kind of admitting the challenges and kind of have sort of saying that some of this work was messy and some of the things that you struggled with as the researcher, and being open and honest to that. Citation, they said, was also something that is important for rhetoric. So sort of citing well-known scholars, writing in terms, making sure that your citations are up to date, things that the authors and the readers can recognize in terms of other scholars that have been well cited or are well known within the literature. And they said that's also important. So as much as it is about writing, it's also about being well read as well, and being sort of up to date with current literature and that.
It's about being able to join the conversation on whatever topic you're writing about and having thorough knowledge of what has been talked about before.
Yeah.
I
know, I've been caught out before as well, where I've sort of submitted a paper to a journal for review, and then the reviewers come back and said, "Oh, but have you read this article?" And then you haven't even heard of this author or this article before, and then when you look at it, you go, "Oh my gosh, how did I miss this? This is such an important article, and it's so relevant to my research." So I suppose making time to also read other people's work, and like you say, kind of connecting the dots with your own thoughts and your own research. And then customer orientation, being smart about wanting to be read. So be very aware of who your audience is, who your journal is, and who the reviewers are, who the sort of editors are. So I always find it's useful as well to kind of, when you are going to submit to a journal, to kind of look at some of the articles that have been published within that journal, to kind of see what are the articles that they like, and what is sort of the flavor essentially, and going onto the journal's website and kind of seeing sort of what is their sort of overarching aim and values, and what is the area that they're really interested in. So to kind of do your homework a little bit before you start writing a particular paper. Craftsmanship is the next point. So reassuring the reader that the process has been appropriately executed, and really to take your reader by the hand. So don't just assume that the readers know what you're talking about, or that the reviewer knows what you're talking about. So really explain each step clearly, explain why you made the choices that you did, and to be very transparent in terms of each process and step within your methods, and also your conceptual frameworks of how has this all formed, how have these ideas developed, and how things were executed. Methodological soundness and rigor, we've spoken about, that you really need to have a detailed and clear method section, and really explaining your rationale for decision making, choices and claims. And then also addressing your epistemological stance and your theoretical underpinnings. I think this is something that we can sometimes get sidetracked from, that you kind of have to keep going back to sort of your research question and sort of your stance in terms of your method choice, sort of where are you coming from in terms of your sort of your theoretical underpinnings.
And that's a tricky one, because the theory in qualitative research is often very confusing, particularly the epistemological and ontological.
Yeah, especially if you are trying to be sort of if you're trying to conduct sort of more practical orientated research or pragmatic research, is that the theoretical can sometimes be difficult to kind of tie together.
But again, it's the reflexivity. So what am I really doing with this project? Where am I coming from? And where am I going with it?
And kind of, I suppose, what is your overall argument?
Mm.
And that was helpful to kind of say, what is my overall argument in terms of what am I trying to say? And seeing sort of how that fits in terms of theory and stance. And then also, Rowan, I think coming back to your comment, is that it's not just about, when it comes to presenting your work, obviously your theory, your methods are really important, but you really need to spend time on your results and leave enough space for your results section as well, in terms of being able to explain your results clearly and to present your results in a way that is articulate and clear as well.
Sounds so easy when you just read it.
Yeah.
Just so easy.
And also to have the space. I always find I really run out of space when it comes to presenting my work. You know, especially something like conversation analysis. Like you can't explain something with 2 lines of a sentence. There's so much more to it, but you don't always have the luxury of word count, sort of endless word count. Authenticity, I think, is really important. I think it's quite clear, I think, when you read a paper, whether someone's being authentic or not, and whether they're being not just authentic to the data, but whether when you write convincingly, I think if you can really sort of, again, put yourself out there and people can kind of really feel that you are passionate and convincing about your topic. You know, you kind of, I don't know, sometimes when you read papers, you can almost feel that, you know, this is not really something that it's not interesting. It seems, almost boring.
Mechanical.
Yeah, mechanical. I think that's a good description, that you're not really convinced as the reader. So being authentic, I think, is really important, and really sort of convincing in the sense that you've been there, that you've sat there with the data, and that they talk about being there deeply and for some time, that you've really engaged with the work and the data.
Well, that I think is a big thing, is you can see. I'm thinking of some of the emergency call papers that Rona and I have been going through. You can see where someone has spent time, developed a relationship with a call center, really immersed themselves in a context, versus someone who's just kind of grabbed something off the web and analyzed it almost clinically rather than immersively.
Yeah. Or sort of, you know, I suppose with these big research grants, sometimes, you know, where you have researchers kind of come into the site for half a morning and then go and write about sort of their experience at the site. And they haven't really spent time at a site and really sort of dwelled and immersed themselves within a particular setting. So really important is journaling and kind of documenting your experiences, how one grappled with the reality of research, and how one engaged with the data, the participants, as well as the ethical dilemmas that they may have experienced. And like I said before, it's not about presenting this perfectly polished, finished product. Readers and reviewers want to know the messy details. And you think that sometimes people don't want to know those messy details, but I think it does provide all this authenticity, and it provides a sort of a realness, I suppose, and it brings sort of a sense of humanity as the researcher. And like you say, the researcher really is part of the research process. They're not removed from it. So you do need to talk about your experience as a researcher as well. And interweaving the researcher's voice and humanity into the research story.
I think this is where, you know, you were saying before about also encouraging readers to be reflexive. And I think when you show the messy bits, when you show this happened, and, you know, like the kind of, I guess, the stumbling blocks, I feel like reading those things myself makes me more likely to reflect on how they might have played out in my own experience. Or, oh, what might have happened for me if that had happened, you know, that kind of. Whereas if you just have like, oh, this and here's the data, you're not engaging with that part.
Yeah. No, I think that's something that really is important when writing about qualitative work. Reflexivity, like we said, this is something that comes up over and over for us. But reflexivity is the act of critical self-reflection on biases and preferences, and it really is central to qualitative inquiry and impactful research. And it is strongly linked to authenticity as well. And we need to think about reflexivity as reflection in action. So while we're doing a project, but also reflection on action, as well as temporal reflections in terms of that these things don't just occur within a vacuum, that they're sort of just before, after, and future. And also, sort of looking at things like moment by moment, and also sort of holistically, and kind of stepping back from the project and looking at the project as a whole in terms of what's happened and how things went well and how things perhaps could be done differently. And like you say, getting your readers to reflect as well.
So I guess that's also where the discussion bit comes in so powerfully, is that gives you the opportunity to really zoom out and do a bird's eye overview of what am I really seeing and what is this project really about.
Yes.
You know, the so what and the what now.
Yes.
So that you don't get so caught up in the minutiae of the details of all this data that you've got. The what exactly, yeah. So it's that constant pulling yourself in and out, you know, and I would say that it really does matter, for example, how you're doing your analysis, because your analysis is going to determine, are you able to get that balance between the minutiae and the bigger picture?
Yes.
Or are you so caught up in the details? Yeah.
And also that insider-outsider paper talked about reflexivity individually and in groups. And I think that's also quite an interesting point.
Absolutely.
And then the use of familiar terms to readers and reviewers, I think, again, it goes about writing clearly and using things that are familiar to the readers. Don't try to be fancy and create all these big words and things that the readers and reviewers are really not going to know what you're talking about. So use familiar terms and not, trying to be overly verbose, I suppose. And then bridging the old with the new. So acknowledging current and existing things and methods and ideas, but also sort of getting people to think about new ideas and perhaps new ways of doing things. And then this is really where this imagination comes in, is sort of these conceptual leaps and serendipity, is that novel ideas emerge from unexpected moments, diverse encounters, and stepping outside traditional research norms. And that these moments are sometimes continuous small leaps rather than one big moment, is that things can sometimes change over time, but just in small incremental steps, rather than this being this big aha thing or event that happens. So to kind of get people to kind of think about things also, I suppose, from a temporal point of view, that over time things might have changed, or rather than there being this one particular event. And then research contingencies and uncertainties, to not necessarily see those as bad things, but to see them as opportunities rather than constraints. So when there are these uncertainties in research or uncertainties in terms of new ways of doing things, to convince your audience that these are really opportunities for learning and for growth and development, rather than saying, well, these are problematic, we need to go back to the old way of doing things, and we can't consider that idea. To be bold in terms of making claims that sometimes uncertainty can be seen as a good thing, and an opportunity for change and learning. And then abduction is really sort of generating ideas, not just understanding current ones. So again, developing and exploring what might be. So this is kind of, again, generating new theories, getting people to think about new ideas and kind of collecting data, and then seeing how that sort of, I suppose, learning from the data, not applying a current theory and then testing the theory in terms of current data. Does that make sense? So sort of almost sort of, yeah, inductive learning rather than deductive learning, I suppose. And then really that there is this tension between creativity and academic norms. While imagination enriches research, publishing pressures often favor conventional structured writing over exploratory storytelling. And that can be really tricky in terms of getting our type of research published within sort of traditional journals, and that you kind of, yeah, that you are often stuck with sort of these stringent guidelines, and people aren't always open to new creative ways of doing research.
I love this page, though, just going back to that. It's really about one's own journey as a qualitative researcher and leaning into things like serendipitous moments or conceptual leaps and what have I learned from my research. And I think this page is really more about you as a researcher than about your writing and your audience. But that obviously is how it comes through, is once you've reflected on your own journey and the kinds of progresses that you're making in your own research in terms of your thinking, your ways of doing, your reflecting,
that's so true.
And then conveying that in your work. Yeah.
And I suppose where you started as an undergrad and how you've ended now, and how you sort of the journey that you've taken, and how a lot of us have kind of gone into a whole new direction, which we didn't think we would end up in. And
Absolutely.
how you learn through your research, and how you perhaps did something 3-4 years ago, or how you thought about something 3-4 years ago might be very different to how you think now. And that it's these continuous small leaps and changes.
And it's okay to say, well, what I published 5 years ago is not what I think now. I've changed my mind, or I do things differently. I think differently.
And I think you always, I think we will always be sort of continuous scholars. Like there is no point that you know all knowledge. Is that knowledge you are continuously learning.
Absolutely.
And I think that's an important point. I put in this diagram, but like I said, I don't love this diagram. I actually found it quite confusing and very busy. I think perhaps I appreciate the points on here, but I think perhaps it could have been done differently.
I think this is the management business background coming through, that they wanted to put it into a
I can't necessarily say how I would change it, but I didn't find it particularly useful. And then in terms of conclusions, qualitative research is increasingly valued, but academic structures remain largely positivist, creating barriers to its acceptance. However, there is a definite shift. I think not just in terms of the journals and what is being published nowadays, but I even see it with grant applications, in that a lot of funders are now starting to consider mixed methods, are starting to say that a qualitative aspect is, imperative to the quantitative data that's being collected. So I think there's a definite shift in terms of valuing what qualitative research brings to the party. And I agree. I think we definitely are being invited to the table in terms of having a seat. Qualitative researchers should continue to strive to be subjective and creative thinkers, and pragmatism, integrity, and continued questioning and re-examining of our work and assumptions is critical. And we need to be capable of writing relevant knowledge. So not just these grand theoretical ideas, but really sort of being able to apply this knowledge in a real world setting.
The so what and the now what and the what does this actually mean?
And in conclusion, the authors say that there really is no perfect template, which I think we would all love, but rather each researcher needs to find their own style, needs to find things that work for them. And they really end by saying these are just some guidelines and ideas, but none of this is necessarily concrete. And then just an additional reading. This was quite a nice paper that I liked. I kind of skimmed over it, but I'd like to read it in more detail. And what was funny is that Michael Pratt, this author, I actually presented this author 2 years ago at our journal club on bricolage.
Oh,
So
okay.
he wrote the paper on bricolage, but he's also written this paper about fitting oval pegs into round holes, tensions, and evaluating and publishing qualitative research in top tier North American journals. He is from the USA. So yeah, that's just an additional paper that aligns nicely with this paper.
And I'm intrigued why he said oval pegs and not square pegs.
Yeah,
there's obviously some meaning. Yeah, close, but not quite. Yeah. So maybe that's one that we need to look at for a future journal club. Yeah. Thank you, Megan. Sure, there's just so much to reflect on and think about in terms of one's own writing. And I guess it's a constant journey that we're on. Yeah, Carl and Edmarie, I don't know if you have anything to add to the conversation here.
Thanks, Jenny. No, I find this very stimulating and I learn quite a lot. And there are things that you know, but it's kind of refreshing to hear it again and to be aware and to be reflexive in terms of your own writing. So thanks, Megan. And thanks that I can join this. I really enjoy this. Thank you very much.
Fabulous. Thanks, Edmarie. Yeah, I completely agree that sometimes just having it reinforced and also understanding that one's not alone in this journey, I think is huge as well. Yeah. And Carl, I don't know if you have anything to add. I hope you found it valuable.
Yes, no, thank you very much. It was very valuable. I had to jump out briefly because of a patient consultation, but I managed to hear the first part. And yeah, I'm learning a lot as we go along. So I'm really very grateful to be able to participate in the journal clubs. Also trying to the one thing that came to mind, I don't know if it was addressed in the second half, sorry I missed some of that, but I'm grappling a lot with the philosophy around the science, and like that we're so strongly in a space where it's a pity that you have to kind of justify the work somehow, and it feels like very unfair in a sense. And it's this interesting dynamic of trying to apologize or trying to not apologize, but to be apologetic or to be, you said to be conscious of how the reviewers, it's like we're thinking for people in a way. So that's an interesting dynamic of how that then leads links to how we write. So yeah, I'm thinking about it a lot, and it's been very stimulating. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Carl. Yeah. So thank you, Megan, for hosting another successful journal club. Yeah, these are always great just to delve into things. And yes, we definitely need to write reflexivity up on the top of the board there, because I think that is our guiding mantra or principle, whatever you want to call it. Yeah, that kind of directs everything we do. And I'm very proud of the way that we've moved into this reflexive space in a very big way. So thinking about why and how we do things, but also how we write about things, very important. So thanks, everybody, and have a good rest of your day, and we'll meet again next month. Thanks for joining.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.